important that children living in the city have access to a good public park as to a good public school. I myself, as a wonder that my life and legacy are so closely associated with North Dakota and the open spaces and with the strenuous life that I lived and preached. For you may know that growing up in New York City, New York, was a very weak and sickly child. I had asthma. Any of you who has asthma, or certainly you've had asthma amongst your charges at school, well, you know it's a terrible disease. To see a small child choking for breath and for life itself. Today, thankfully, the asthmatic child has the inhaler to restore breath, hopefully quickly. In my day, we had no such medicine. In my day, the treatment for asthma was worse than the disease. Can you imagine giving a small asthmatic boy a cigar to smoke? The idea was that coughing would stimulate my breathing. I was given bitter black coffee to drink, again as a stimulant, and I was given ipecac syrup to drink. Oh, I hear by the groans and grimaces of some of my colleagues, especially those with just a bit of snow atop the peak, or not much atop the peak. Well, you know ipecac syrup. I see a blank stare on some of the younger faces. Young man, ipecac syrup is something that you drink in order to see your lunch. Twice. Unpleasant memories for me to this very day. And when I was a young boy of 11, still very weak and sickly, so much smaller and weaker than the children my own age, my father, Theodore Roosevelt, the man for whom I am named, the greatest man I ever knew, he called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the seriousness of the subject to follow, but rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known in the family, T.D., he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body." I said, "Father, I shall." And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights, I swam, I rowed, I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner. Lightweight runner-up at Harvard. I better get about the work. I got about the work and I built my body. It does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. But when I was your president at 5'8" and 220 solid pounds, I was but a mere feather of a man compared to my successor, William Howard Taft. At times, Taft tipped the scales at over 350 pounds. And yes, it's true, he once got stuck in the White House bathtub. When I was your president and Taft our governor in the Philippines, we had word that Taft was in ill health with fever, perhaps near death. My secretary war, Elihu Root, a New York man, cabled to the Philippines inquiring as to Taft's health, and thankfully Taft cabled back, "Health fine. Rode horse 20 miles this morning." Root cabled back, "How's the horse?" And in New York, at a Republican banquet in 1912, after I bolted the Republican Party to be the progressive Bull Moose candidate, the party taking its nickname from a statement I'd famously made to the press when I declared for the Republican nomination that spring, I said I was stripped to the waist, healthy as a bull moose, and that my hat was in the ring. The first time that phrase from pugilism had been used to declare a candidacy. As I was campaigning across the country for the Bull Moose campaign, Taft, reluctantly, he couldn't run a Rose Garden campaign. He was so unpopular with the grassroots, even of his own party, Lincoln's Republican Party, the shopkeepers, the mechanics, the farmers, but he had the backing of a special interest on Wall Street. And they convinced him to go to New York City and make a speech to a fine Republican banquet. And before introducing the president, Senator Chauncey Depew, a famous New York wit, he had some fun at the president's expense. He patted President Taft on Taft's enormous tummy, and he inquired of the president, he said, "Mr. President, is it a boy or a girl?" President Taft, a jolly fellow, didn't miss a beat. He said, "If it's a boy, I will name him Virtue. If it's a girl, I will call her Integrity. If, however, it's simply hot air and gas, I will call it Chauncey Depew." Well, I want you to know that I don't think any president ever enjoyed himself in the White House as much as I did, nor that any family enjoyed themselves more than the Roosevelt family. Mrs. Roosevelt and I reared 6 children there. Mrs. Roosevelt said she reared 7 children there, that I was her worstest and most terrible child. Oh, I worked hard for the American people for what I called the square deal. And I said, when you work, work hard. When you play, play hard. When you work, don't play at all. But when the work day was over, I played hard. I did not have a kitchen cabinet of informal advisors like President Jackson. My informal advisors were known as members of the tennis cabinet. By invitation at the end of the workday, members of Congress, diplomats, Army and Navy officers would come to the White House, and we would play lawn tennis on the south lawn of the White House. Now, I never allowed myself to be photographed in my tennis costume, believing the sport entirely too effete for American tastes. But we played tennis in a very manly way. I enjoyed the fact that if you deadened the ball against your opponent's body, you not only won the point, but had the chance of raising a mark of victory on your opponent as well. In the White House, I boxed with Army and Navy officers and with former heavyweight champs like John L. Sullivan. I wrestled jiu-jitsu and sumo with great bare-chested men brought over by the Japanese ambassador. And I played single stick. Professor, have you ever played single stick, sir?
Not played, no.
Oh, you know the game, though. Think of Robin Hood and Friar Tuck, where men beat each other about the head with a giant wooden staff. Great bully fun. Entirely understandable, though, if a man has played the sport and can't remember. The game that I enjoyed most, though, was an outdoor game, a hiking game, perhaps even a game that you might be able to incorporate into your important work. It was a game called Point to Point. The way we played point to point in Oyster Bay, Long Island, with the Roosevelt children and their cousins was to first spin a small Roosevelt child around at point A. Wherever that dizzy child came to rest and pointed beyond the horizon was some imaginary point B, towards which we raced in single file. The rule being that whenever you came to an obstacle, a downed tree, a creek, a cliff, a barn, a haystack, you never went around the obstacle, but always and only over it, under it, or through it. What makes for great dirty fun? We really should play it here in Medora. Beware the barbed wire if you do. I imported this game to Washington, D.C. and played the game with members of Congress and diplomats and with Army and Navy officers that showed themselves entirely too unfit physically to keep up with a fat asthmatic president racing through the woods. The most famous of my point-to-points was with the French ambassador, Jean-Jules Jusserand. Ambassador Jusserand came to the White House, obviously disregarding the part of the invitation that said, "Wear your dirty clothes," for he arrived wearing the finest French silks of the French court. Off we rode our horses to Rock Creek Park, dismounted, raced through the woods for several hours, eventually coming to the Potomac River. The French ambassador greatly relieved. He had sweat through his clothes. This being a very fast, deep, and wide-running portion of the river, the French ambassador thought certainly this was our terminus, that we would return to the White House for some well-earned refreshments. But I turned to the gentleman with me and I said, "Gentlemen, let us take off our clothes, put the bundles atop our heads, swim across the river, put our clothes back on dry, and continue our hike down the cliffs opposite." Can you imagine such a thing today? I think CNN would go live from a helicopter. As we entered the water, I saw that the French ambassador, while he had disrobed, he kept on his lavender kid gloves. I said, "Mr. Ambassador, why you kept on your gloves?" He said, "Monsieur President, that's in case we meet any ladies." Fashions have changed along the waterfront a great deal in a century, I assure you. I've got a little sports story for you. Well, two things. If our friends from Nebraska were here, I would have to thank them, Governor Ricketts and the Ricketts family, for purchasing that baseball team in Chicago. My goodness, I never again will have to hear the last time the Cubs won the World Series, Teddy Roosevelt was the president. I'm tired of hearing that after 108 years. But the sports story I'd like to tell you is about football. Do we have any fans of football here? Any of you men or women football fans? I wonder if you're familiar with a book called The Big Scrum, subtitled How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football in America. The year is 1905. I held a conference at the White House, famously attended by college presidents and football coaches. Walter Camp, the famous player coach from Yale, often talked of as the father of modern football. The game was a very violent game then. It was only 5 yards for a first down. The forward pass was not yet legal. The game was greatly violent, and there was an offensive play called the flying wedge. The defense was required to stand at the defensive line of scrimmage. The offense could start at a run from 20 yards away in the shape of a wedge, very often putting the biggest and strongest boys at the point of the wedge and attempting to run that wedge into what they perceived as the weakest point of the defensive line. When the wedge smashed into the defensive line, very often inside the wedge, the smallest boy on the offense, being given the football, would be hurled bodily by his teammates over the defensive line, attempting to gain the entire 5 yards in one flying leap. Very often, boys broke their necks, skulls were crushed. Can you imagine that game every year if 12, 15, or a score or more of players were killed or greatly wounded on the college football field? A boy in Georgia was killed. The state legislature considered legislation to outlaw the game. And the boy's parents testified in front of the General Assembly against the legislation. They said their boy loved football. I myself said that the game taught so much that I'd rather keep the game with its violence than lose the game. But I said the game was on trial, and unless we came up with rules for the safety of the players, the game may be outlawed. President Eliot at my alma mater, Harvard, had said that the game could not be played by Harvard. Well, those men went about negotiating, and much to the consternation of Walter Camp, for he did not like the idea, the forward pass was made legal. 10 yards for a first down. It spread the field out, and the number of injuries and deaths fell precipitously. The National Collegiate Athletic Association, being founded in 1906, was a direct result of the White House Conference of 1905. So you may know that the Public Service Award given by the NCAA is the Theodore Roosevelt Public Service Award. Of recent years, Peter Ueberroth, a water polo player at UCLA, was just awarded, and in some past years, Alan Page, the Purple People Eater of the Minnesota Vikings. He, a member of the Minnesota Supreme Court, was given the award as well. My boys played football at Groton. Ted Jr. was on the third team at Harvard, but I wrote my boys. Well, it's a wonderful thing if, as a young man's known as a wonderful quarterback or wide receiver. If, however, when he's an older man, the best that can be said about him is that when he was a young man, he was a pretty good quarterback or a great wide receiver. It's not much of a use of a life. Sports are game, and life is not a game. There's serious things to be done in this country. And the highest office in the land is not president, it is citizen. And I know that many of you are here, and your colleagues in other district conferences, because iron sharpens iron, and you're ready to do your duties as citizens and teachers and leaders. You're going to lobby Congress for the right sort of funding and support for your programs at the state and local level. Well, I was a progressive on so many issues, and I discovered that very often the opposite of progress was Congress. But I wish you all the best in the result for the work that you do. You probably all know the book of recent years, now maybe even a decade old, Last Child in the Woods. It's been identified by teachers. The author's name again?
Richard Love?
Yes, Richard Love. Louvre, like the Louvre out in France. Well, that San Diego newspaper man, he interviewed people like you, and everyone was unanimous. Children are suffering from a condition that they call outdoor deficit disorder. I do hope that in your curriculums you can get the children outdoors. And not necessarily in some sort of organized sport, but maybe something like point to point, which I can tell he was very disorganized, or to get those children to climb up buttes, like here in Medora, to climb trees, and yes, to fall down and scrape themselves up a little bit, because there's something that a child learns after they've scraped themselves and hurt themselves, when they rub away the pain and the dirt and they get back into the game. Well, that's what it's all about, isn't it? That's the benefit of sports and sports education, is learning that it's teamwork, and that when you get knocked down, you get back up again. Well, I wish to give you some words of encouragement as I conclude. I toured Europe after my son Kermit and I went hunting in Africa, famously in 1909 and 1910. I spoke at the great universities, including in April 1910 at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris. I made a speech there, which is amongst the most famous of my utterances. You're delighted to know, and I'm sure your host, Ms. Hewer, is delighted to know, I shall not recite the speech in its entirety. But you can look up Citizenship in a Republic. It's a small portion of that speech which remains famous to this day. And I'm delighted to know that these words today are stenciled below decks on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The Navy calls that great nuclear aircraft carrier, 5,000 souls aboard, and statistically, probably one or two of your students serving aboard that ship. They call it the Big Stick, as in that old African proverb I first quoted at the Minnesota State Fair. You're doing good deeds, not only as teachers and administrators and professors. You're doing good deeds in your communities. Good deeds for physical education, conservation, the arts, good deeds at your churches, your temples, your synagogues. Well, this is America. No good deed goes unpunished. Certainly no good deed goes without its second guessing, its Monday morning quarterbacking, its criticism. Persist in your good deeds. The Republic needs them now more than ever. And when you are criticized, take heart from the words I shared with the French a century ago and with you here in beloved Medora this morning. Remember, it is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man, and today to the woman, who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends herself in a worthy cause, who in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, that his name should never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Good citizens and members of SHAPE, we've all known victory, we've all known defeat. Even the youngest of your charges knows that in every lifetime there will be tragedy and hardship and defeat. Life will knock you down. Your duty to yourselves, indeed to your families, to your institutions, to the Republic, is that when life does knock you down, just like those little children, you're to get back up again, dust yourself off, and get back into the fight for life. Now you may say, as one senator said coming to the White House, "Mr. President, you're preaching." I said, "Senator, you're right. And the presidency is a bully pulpit, too." Now the bully pulpit is a very nice golf course nearby Medora. Testimony to the fact that time and history have marched on, and my legacy is just so much dust in the streets of history. But I hope that there's something of the legacy of the strenuous life, which really means a life lived vigorously in the service of others, that you might still take inspiration from as you visit Medora here. And I thank you all for, in the big scope of things, you're all striving and achieving to leave your campground cleaner than you found it. A man and a woman, they've never stood so tall as when they stoop to help a child. And in the important work that you're doing, you're helping our children to live healthier lives and to be better citizens. And for that, you have my eternal gratitude. Godspeed and bully to your conference, members of SHAPE. Delightful.